And so we're going to get started on time today. This is a CME activity sponsored by the Hawaii Consortium for Continuing Medical Education, a joint venture between the Hawaii Medical Association and the John A. Burns School of Medicine, University of Hawaii. Please use the white evaluation form to evaluate today's session. In exchange, you will receive CME credit for your completed evaluation form. At the closing of today's presentation, we will have a short, at least 5-minute Q&A session, and all audience members, including those attending by VTC, are welcome to ask questions by using the microphone. You can also email Noreen with your questions or comments. She will provide your questions on your behalf. Consistent with HCCME's policy, speakers are expected to disclose at the beginning of their presentation any significant financial or other relationships with the manufacturer of any commercial technology, program, product, or service discussed in their presentation. This policy is intended to make you aware of the speaker's financial or other relationships so you may form your own judgments about the material discussed. Dr. Thomas Cook has disclosed that he has no financial interest arrangement or relationship that could be perceived as a real or apparent conflict of interest in the context of the subject of this presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tommy Cook, a fourth-year resident in the psychiatry program at the Department of Psychiatry, Jabsom University of Hawaii. He will be graduating soon and plans to continue to practice in Hawaii. He completed his Doctor of Medicine from the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago and enjoys reading, writing, and presenting. This is actually his second grand rounds as a resident. His first topic on Freud was last year, and he has written a book chapter, Ethics of Organ Transplant, and is writing a number of papers. I hope you find his presentation provoking. At the conclusion of the session, you will be able to decide whether the mind is nothing more than the brain or whether it is something else. List the classic arguments for mind's immateriality as well as the challenges of contemporary neuroscience to those arguments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tommy Cook.
Your brain, is it mindless? Surely nobody wants to be called mindless. You wouldn't think so anyway. But the view that the mind is nothing more than the brain, that talking about mental states is only a confused way of talking about brain states, that the mind is merely a useful fiction, this sort of thing is the dominant view nowadays. A substantial portion of psychiatrists and neuroscientists believe they do not really have minds. The mind's a spooky thing, after all. We can see each other's brains on an MRI scan, but we can't see each other's minds. Not only can the mind not be observed scientifically, it is notoriously difficult to measure. So it's invisible, and it can't be properly measured. It's a spooky thing, kind of like the soul, which probably explains why so many psychiatrists and neuroscientists think it is merely a useful fiction, and that one day we will understand the brain well enough to see how silly a fiction it really is. I, on the other hand, and I'm not alone, I think the mind is as real an entity as the brain, not deciding where it is, but I think it's real, even if it is invisible and impossible to measure. And I think it is horribly misguided to entertain the hope that neuroscience will one day debunk the mind. There are many reasons to think that will not be the case, and it's the purpose of this talk to show you just some of those reasons. Most of them come from philosophy and psychology, so be aware the material you will see in this talk is eclectic. So I will go ahead and answer my title, the short version. Your brain, is it mindless? No. You can go now. No. I don't believe this is just an intellectual issue. We ought to take it seriously. I think it has dire consequences for psychiatry. The idea that psychiatry will one day be overrun by geneticists and neuroscience can be damaging. It may speed up neuroscience research, but it will all but destroy psychotherapy training and psychiatry programs. And I believe that it's already doing so. It may have sped the development of medications, but it has undoubtedly left us in the thrall of the pharmaceutical industry, and it may affect the way we prescribe medicine. For example, When a patient receives a new prescription and then returns a week or two later reporting improved mood, how often does the prescriber doubt that the medication was the reason? We don't, usually. Placebo effects don't fit in our stock way of thinking, placebo effects being in the mind rather than in the brain. As Mintz and Belknap report, the quantity of literature on treatment resistance now doubles every 5 years, and at the same time, psychotherapy training at programs continues to decline. Again, this idea that psychiatry is ultimately a brain profession rather than a mind profession, I don't think it's an innocent idea. I think it has far-ranging effects. Now, are there any obvious reasons why our mind may not be reducible to brain matter? Well, yes, there are. In the first place, thought doesn't seem material. Matter exists in one place and not in another. It can't move to a new place without leaving the place it started. If mind were matter, we'd expect it to be constrained by those limits. But are our thoughts so constrained? The same thought seems present in many minds at once. It begins in some minds without ceasing in others. Matter follows the law of conservation. It cannot be created or lost. So in a lecture hall like this, if mind were matter, we'd expect mental energy to be conserved. But what really happens in a lecture hall? Energy is not conserved. Ideas begin in one mind, and then they crop up in dozens of minds, your minds, with no diminution elsewhere. And another thing, you do seem to be able to defy matter. Seem. You can levitate an object. Lift your bag. You're levitating an object. Physicalist philosophers would warn us, and when I say physicalist, I mean the view that unless something's physical, it ain't real. Physicalist philosophers such as Paul Churchland would warn us if we are thinking we are defying matter by lifting our bag, that we can't be too cautious with our so-called common sense. One's introspective certainty, Churchland said, that one's mind is a seat of beliefs and desires may be as badly misplaced as was classical man's certainty that the star-flecked sphere of the heavens turns daily. Churchland thinks, and his sentiments are common, that since the common sense notion that we're defying matter by lifting our bag, that this notion tells us nothing about the wonders of how the brain works, tells us nothing about the ability to catch a fly ball on the run, nothing about a 2D image in the retina becoming a 3D in the occipital cortex. If the so-called mind, just reflecting on itself, can tell us little about the wonders of the brain, then it's only an old notion waiting to be discarded. Churchland thinks that such folk notions are just waiting for neuroscience to be put out of date. Neuroscience to put them out of date. For now, I would only retort, I wonder whether Churchland holds the same suspicion towards the common sense notion that the rules of logic which exist in the mind are at all valid, the rules on which science is built. I wonder if he holds the same suspicion towards the common sense notion that genocide is wrong. Excitement over what science may one day uncover, I think, is one thing, but it's another thing, I think, to be so scientifically enthusiastic that you, so to speak, lose your mind, or lose the mind. It's true the mind is invisible, doesn't lend to observation, but to limit yourself strictly to the world of science because you can see things better there is a bit like the man at night who wandered around under the street light trying to find his car keys because the light's better there. No less an authority than the physicist Schrödinger said, "The scientific picture of the world around me is very deficient. It gives me a lot of factual information, but it's ghastly silent about all that's really near to our heart, that really matters. It can't tell a word about the sensation of red, blue, bitter, sweet, feelings of delight and sorrow. It knows nothing of beauty, ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are so often very silly that we're not inclined to take them very seriously," end quote. For an example of the silliness Schrödinger spoke of, take the fact, say, B.F. Skinner, who did not believe in the mind, tried his best to define love in behavioral terms. His definition of love, hours spent together. This is what I think Schrödinger meant by silly. Skinner went and took Occam's razor and just went wild with it. He shaved away at love until what was left wasn't really love at all. He shaved away at the mind until there was no mind. Surely it would be strange for a man to go in a barber's shop and come out not only with no beard, but no head. In fact, I've always wondered if the name Skinner had anything to do with his philosophy. Some things we'll just never know. Aristotle said that you first have to kill a thing in order to analyze it. The animal in its natural habitat is never the same animal that we dissect. Something has changed. Something has departed from it. When you look at people from a tall building, they move and they look like ants. But does that mean they're as mindless and soulless as ants? Why is the view from a tall building more real than, say, psychotherapy, when the person looks straight back at you in the face? Forgive me for a crude picture, but when you kiss a person on the lips, do you think of kissing the opening portion of a 40-foot-long digestive tract? Is the 40-foot-long digestive tract what's really there and mental experience of the kiss an illusion? A woman's eyes may be gazed into by her lover, or they may be looked into by an optometrist. Does the optometrist see the same thing or more than the lover? In Shakespeare's Hamlet, Polonius asks Hamlet, "What do you read, my lord?" And Hamlet replies, "Words, words, words." And in one sense, he's right. A book is filled with words, just as people look like ants from a building. A mouth is the beginning of a 40-foot-long tube. The eyes are the organs of vision. But in another sense, Hamlet's wrong, horribly wrong. That's why Tolkien put in the mouth of Gandalf the wizard a wise quote. "He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom." Now, before we go any further, I need to get one thing out of the way that perturbs me on this subject more than any other. It's this whole notion that brain scans show that the mind is nothing but the brain. For example, imagine a man is praying to God while undergoing an EEG or any scan. And on the left-hand column, let's put all the events that occur on the EEG. Let's put on the right-hand column everything that occurs in the mind during an EEG. Now, a physicalist may argue, whenever the brainwaves stopped, the man stopped praying. So the waves must be the cause of prayer. This argument is bosh. I'm here to tell you, this argument, no matter how widespread it is bosh. It's as silly as arguing that if a man can take a knife to the Mona Lisa and destroy it in a matter of minutes, then the Mona Lisa amounts to nothing but a few shreds of paper. Or since his aggression and base instincts ruined it, then it was only a creation of aggression and base instincts. It's as silly as arguing that if a sculptor uses a bad chisel and makes a bad statue, then the chisel is the source of his knowledge and craft. Again, and this example is from Antony Flew. Imagine a satellite phone washes ashore on a remote island, an island inhabited by a tribe that's never had contact with civilization. The natives play with the numbers on the dial pad and hear different voices on hitting certain sequences. This is a U.S. Nimitz. Waters are choppy. 10-4, over. They assume that it's the device making the noise. Some of the cleverer natives, the scientists of the tribe, assemble an exact replica and hit the numbers again. They hear the voices again. The conclusion is obvious. The particular combination of crystals and metals and chemicals produces what seems like human voices. And this means the voices are simply properties of the device. But the tribal sage summons the scientists to the mountain for a discussion. He has thought long and hard on the matter, and he's reached the following conclusion. The voices coming from the handset may be coming from beyond the handset. That through some mysterious communication, they're in touch with other humans. But the scientists simply laugh at the sage. They say, look, when we damage the instrument, the voices stop. So they're obviously nothing more than sounds produced by a unique combination of lithium and printed circuit boards and light-emitting diodes. And many scientists today are like those natives who think that thoughts must be products of the brain, that the brain produces thoughts like the liver produces bile. There actually was an odd case like this on a psych ward in Florida, and I have Dr. Ritter to thank for getting it to me. There was a case in 2011 of a man on a Florida psych ward who heard voices and music in his head. The residents were stumped. He wasn't schizophrenic, he didn't abuse ice, antipsychotics didn't help much. He's about to be discharged on risperidone when an astute resident tried an experiment. Brought the man an FM/AM radio, went through the stations one by one. All of a sudden, the man cried out, "That's the one!" Turns out he was actually able to match what was in his head with an AM station. As they find out after the CT scan, he was a Vietnam vet who had shrapnel lodged in his mastoid process. The shrapnel was picking up AM radio and vibrating his cochlea. True case. This real case, like the parable of the natives on the beach, is instructive. Those who believe the mind is only the brain are like the natives on the beach. They are barbarians. Barbarians that break a thing to find out what it is. If we're going to speak properly of the mind, if we're going to do it justice by speaking about it on its own terms, we need to be more specific about what the mind actually does. Classically, the mind consists of thoughts, feelings, and desires. We think, we feel, we want. In the cognitive division of the mind, there are learning, perception, memory, and abstract thought. Arguably, there's more, imagination, for example, but most are variations on these. The affective division of the mind contains anxiety and all the other emotions. In the cognitive division, and cognitive is just the older term for the will, there are the appetites, or drives or urges, and there are purposes and desires, and finally there's choices or decisions made by the will itself. John Dewey put the mind's functions in colloquial terms. In our memory, we are reminded of this or that. In abstract thought, we not only keep things in mind, but we bring mind to bear on our problems and perplexities. In affection, the mother minds her baby and cares for it. When purposefully striving, we mind our step, or we have a mind to do this or that. Finally, children choose to mind their parents when they choose to obey them. Or not. You might be surprised to see the appetites or instincts considered as part of the mind. I won't discuss them because they're so obviously bodily. But actually, in pre-modern psychology, from Aristotle to Aquinas, there were rational appetites as well as irrational ones. To take an example, we still today use the term abulia, meaning lack of motivation. Well, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics used the Greek term boulesis, meaning a rational desire for happiness, like an instinct, but rational. And we still have the term abulia, in which that boulesis survives. In this talk, I will use this slide as an outline, roughly. We don't have time to talk about every topic, but I will hit on most of them. The mind seems to have several other attributes that are equally applicable to thoughts, feelings, and desires, and these parts are consciousness, intentionality, conscience, and the self, and I will address some of them. The X's here are the attributes that I don't have enough time to talk about. Conscience, for instance, is such a huge topic, it deserves its own talk. Whether our conscience is merely an evolved tendency to think and feel a certain way or something more is a huge question. Let's look at some of these in a bit more detail. First up, learning. Where does our mind get its ideas from? Does our mind get its thoughts from the outside through the senses? Sensation is, after all, a physical affair. If all our ideas could be shown to come from sense impressions, this would go a long way to dethroning the mind. Can this be shown? It's been attempted by David Hume and other empiricists, but it's difficult to show. There are many ways knowledge seems to be independent of sensation. I quote from Daniel Robinson. If our knowledge were hostage to sensation, how could we recognize the same book on successive occasions? With each alteration in the position of the eyes or the head, with each change in the distance of the percipient and the object, there are gross changes at the level of sensation. But the known object has what is called object permanence, which survives whole storms of sensory alterations, end quote. He's, of course, referring to Piaget there, but also to the Gestalt psychologists who showed that when the mind sees a dinner plate turn on its axis, it thinks round instead of oval. If our minds weren't able to do this, sensation would be a buzzing, blooming confusion, to use a phrase from William James. Furthermore, some knowledge is not dependent on sensation at all. For instance, you probably surmise that your colleagues have minds, just as you have a mind. We assume everyone we meet has a mind, ordinarily. Zombies, we leave out. But in general, we assume people have minds like we have minds. But have you ever seen a mind? No, we know it apart from sense observation. all the truths of mathematics are understood apart from observation. A perfect circle, for instance, has never been observed by your senses. Yet you do know what it is. Finally, some knowledge of some objects, like a 103-sided figure, do not seem to be dependent on sensation. St. Augustine argued you can know the difference between a 3 and a 4-sided figure using your imagination. You think of a triangle and a square. But a 103 and a 104-sided figure, you can't use your imagination or senses to see the difference. But you do know the difference. Let's scrap all that. Let's say knowledge does at least originate in sensation. Is there still a case for the mind? According to Aristotle and Aquinas, there is. Aquinas, for instance, was a bona fide empiricist who believed the mind is still immaterial and incorporeal, not a bodily organ. Aquinas argued that for our mind to sense and understand all material objects indiscriminately, it could not itself be one of those objects. If a mind were nothing more than the brain, it would be limited in its ability to form conceptions of anything in the world. But our minds do not seem to be so limited. We seem to be able to form a conception of anything, from an amoeba to an asteroid. Aquinas wrote, "The principle of intellectual operation, which we call the soul of man, is incorporeal. For it is clear that by means of the intellect man can know all corporeal things. Now whatever knows certain things cannot have any of them in its own nature, because that which is in it naturally would impede the knowledge of anything else. Thus we observe a sick man's tongue, being unbalanced by a feverish or bitter humor, is insensible to anything sweet, and everything seems bitter to it. Therefore, if the intellectual principle contained within itself the nature of any body, it would be unable to know all bodies. If it were a body, the determinate nature of that organ would impede knowledge of any and all bodies, as when a certain color is not only in the lens of the eye, but also in a glass vase. The liquid in the vase seems to be of that same color." End quote. I think Aquinas makes a decent argument, actually. How could our brain discriminate between objects if it is itself an obstructing object, like a sick tongue by which everything tastes bitter or a lens by which everything is violet? There's no camera on Earth that can make a picture of an amoeba and an asteroid. The construction of the lens prohibits it. But if your mind is a physical object like a camera, how in the world is it able to have accurate conceptions of virtually anything in the universe? Perception. Let's say you're perceiving a cheeseburger. It's warm, it's juicy, it has a savory aroma. But now, what if you look at it under the microscope? Does it have any of those qualities? Warmness? That's just motion of particles. Juiciness? H2O content. Savory aroma? We all know that's just fatty acid molecules that aerosolize and hit your olfactory epithelium. We have to admit that as a chemical molecular object, a cheeseburger has none of these qualities. The qualities are in our minds. Philosophers call these qualities qualia. Qualia cannot be found in cheeseburgers no matter what sort of microscope you have. Imagine a neuroscientist named Mary. Mary lives and does research in a locked facility. In fact, she's born there. Since the time of her birth, she's never seen anything but black and white. Black and white TV screens, black and white books, black and white knobs and dials. However, she happens to be the leading neuroscientist in the world in understanding how colors are perceived. She knows every possible thing there is to know about how a so-called red object, which emits light at a wavelength of 650 nanometers, hits the retinal proteins, causing conformational change, leading to ion changes down the optic nerve. She knows everything about nerve transduction in the occipital cortex, everything that happens there and elsewhere in the brain. She understands all this in her black and white world. Now imagine the day comes when Mary questions all this. She makes her escape from the locked facility. Opening the door, sunlight overwhelms her weak eyes. She blinks. She looks on a rose patch. She sees a rose for the first time in her life. She sees the color red for the first time. Question: has she learned anything new about the world? Has she learned anything new about the perception of red? If you say yes, and there is a strong tendency to say yes, then you have to admit that the experience of seeing red, the qualia redness, is as much a part of reality as any brain process. But remember, redness is not technically in the rose, just as hot, juicy, and savory aren't technically in the cheeseburger, nor is redness in the brain. So if redness is a part of reality, and if it's not in the brain, where is it? I don't know. But let's not answer it reductively. Leibniz, the philosopher, said if you magnified a brain to 1,000 times its size and replaced all the neurons with mechanical parts and walked inside of it as in a giant clock, you wouldn't be able to find any qualia. Nowhere amongst the gears would you find what it's like to see blue. You might find big zapping wires, chemical fluctuations that correspond to what it's like to see blue, but the what it's like part you wouldn't find. So if you want to say the mind is nothing more than the brain, you have to say that all qualia are illusions. You have to say with John Locke that the sensation of pain is an illusion. For our pain in our mind has nothing to do with the shape or attributes of the needle, say, that provoked it. You have to say hotness isn't real at all because it has nothing to do with rapidly moving particles. You have to say redness isn't as real as it is physically real, an electromagnetic radiation at a wavelength of 650 nanometers. Are you willing to say none of those mental qualia are real? If you aren't willing to say that, you're in good company. You are in the company of the Gestalt psychologists, such as Curler, who famously said of perception that the whole is different than the sum of its parts. So to recap, one of the funny things about perception is that qualia seem to exist in the mind, but they can't be found in matter or in the brain. But there's another funny thing about perception. Your perceptions are private. They can't be shared. Your perceptions cannot be observed by anybody else. Your brain can by a neurosurgeon, but your perceptions cannot. Imagine a man comes rushing in the ER with his hand cut off. You observe him screaming and yelling at the top of his lungs. You think to yourself, that man must be in a lot of pain. But since his pain is subjective, how do you know that for sure? Suppose he has Munchausen's. He injected Novocaine into his arm, a lot of it, prior to lopping it off. Suppose he's only faking. You have to admit this is possible. Ultimately, we rely on patients to honestly report their mind states. You can't peer into another person's mind the way a neurosurgeon peers into a skull, or you peer under your friend's car hood to take a look at their engine. This should be a familiar problem to psychiatrists. Day after day, we are forced to trust what our patients report about their mind. If they're shy, we don't get the data we want. If they lie to us, we don't get the data we want. This is why Harry Stack Sullivan said, the data of psychiatry arise only in participant observation. The psychiatrist cannot stand off at one side, apply his sense organs, however refined they may be, without becoming personally implicated in the operation. His principal instrument of observation is his self, his personality, him as a person, end quote. Sullivan hit on one of the reasons psychotherapy research is so difficult. It really is almost impossible to see on a video camera what would happen without the video camera. Reality TV is not reality. Looking at the human mind is a bit like looking at Giardia. When you try to look at it, it looks back at you. Medical school joke. Humans are the wildest, the most elusive species on the planet. It's nearly impossible to observe them in their natural habitat, for their natural habitat is when they know they're not being observed. In a way, it's tempting to view this tendency of the human mind to resist investigation as quite perverse. After all, how can mental events be properly studied? How are we supposed to verify and falsify supposed mental events and look into their causes? Isn't it a bit like the paranormal enthusiasts who claim that ghosts don't like to be on camera? And trust me, I'm very sympathetic with this frustration. But if we go so far as to say the mind can't be as real as the brain, because whereas the brain allows scientific investigation, the mind does not, I think we'd have a pretty bad argument. As G.K. Chesterton wrote, the fact that ghosts prefer darkness no more disproves the existence of ghosts than the fact that lovers prefer darkness. disproves the existence of love. If you choose to say, I'll believe Miss Brown called her fiancé a periwinkle, or any other endearing term, if she will repeat the word before 17 psychologists, then I will sharply reply, very well, if those are your conditions, you'll never get the truth, for she certainly will not. It's just as unscientific as it is unphilosophical to be surprised that in an unsympathetic atmosphere, certain extraordinary sympathies don't arise. It's as if I said I could not tell you there was a fog because the air wasn't clear enough, or if I insisted on perfect sunlight in order to see an eclipse. End quote. It's that same scientific attitude that led the man to look for his keys under the street light, because the light's better here. Yes, the mind may be elusive, but let's not hold that against it. Interestingly, some futurists, such as Ray Kurzweil, actually do think that one day mental privacy will be overcome by interconnecting our brains with synthetic wires and computers. We will be able to communicate wordlessly, Kurzweil says. Now, to think that that's even possible, I think you have to not only disbelieve in mental privacy, but you have to believe the mind is nothing but the brain and that its thoughts may be interchangeable, may be transplanted, like software from brain to brain. You have to believe, I think, the somewhat strange idea that there's nothing per se about your thoughts that make them your thoughts, that your own thoughts could just as easily become somebody else's, like software on computers. But think about that for a minute. Your thoughts not belonging to you. Isn't that what psychotics think? Can you really think that mental privacy is an illusion shared only by the healthy, and that psychotic individuals who believe in thought broadcasting are closer to the truth? This issue of mental privacy seems to imply another aspect of mind, this strange and central thing we call the self. The self is another big problem for physicalists. Daniel Robinson relates, one of the defining features of mind is that its contents are uniquely owned in that every idea or feeling or desire is someone's. The contents of consciousness can be expressed but not relocated. One can describe a toothache, but you can't give your toothache to another. Even if Smith and Jones both have toothaches of identical intensity and even felt in precisely the same part of the left incisor, each nonetheless had a uniquely possessed sensation. Mental contents on this understanding are unlike pencils, peaches, or prawns. It is in the very nature of mind that each mind is someone's and no other's. There have been philosophers such as John Locke, David Hume, who argue that the self is not a simple, single spiritual substance like it seems to be, but that it's merely a bundle of experiences. According to this theory, it's the bundle of experience, the mere aggregate that makes you, you, rather than any self having those experiences. There does seem to be, I think, some merit in that theory. For example, Freud showed the superego, something we think is part of ourselves, is actually of social origin and of experiential origin. In the healthy state, our conscience seems to be us as well as speak to us, but maybe this is an illusion. In psychosis or depression, the superego may revert back to its origins and sound like it's coming from out there, even though it's part of you. But there's also seems to be major problems with this bundle view. There seems to be part of us that grows and changes as we grow and gain experiences, true, but surely there seems to be a deeper part of what is called our self that hasn't changed since we were young children. After all, would it make sense to say, when I was 3, I was a rascal, if the I in either case were very different? When I was 3, I was a rascal. How could the I be the same I? So our very way of speaking seems to contradict this bundle view of self. And as Thomas Reid pointed out, if our identity is a composition rather than a singularity, if that composition was mix and matchable, we'd be like Frankenstein. We'd be monsters. Our mental contents would be interchangeable. How absurd it would be, Reid said, to say that my memory, another man's imagination, and a third man's reason may make one individual intelligent being. Again, I think it seems most sensible to say there is somebody behind your mental faculties, behind your experiences, whose faculties and experiences they are. And for those at other sites, I'm skipping a slide. Let's talk about memory now. Here's a couple figures. What do they remind you of? Do they remind you of anything you're familiar with? Perhaps very familiar with? How about the letters H and R? Most people don't think of the letters H and R, and as Curler and the Gestalt psychologists were at great pains to show, this is not what you'd expect if the mind were merely an elaborate machine. You've seen the letters H and R probably millions of times in your life. If memories were stored in a mechanical fashion, stored by laws of resemblance and association, if memories bunched together according to how similar they are, then we would not expect this result. We would not expect a portion of the letters H and R to fail to recall the letters H and R, but it does fail. Recall is not mosaic. It's not neutral to its surroundings, and it's not neutral to its overall shape, its overall quiddity, its total organization. This is why the Gestalt psychologists were very fond of saying the total is different than the sum of its parts. And by total, they mean the overall shape. But if memory were merely a function of the brain, would we expect the total organization to be so prominent a feature of memory? The body is, after all, a mosaic of cells. If memory is entirely brain-based, you'd expect memory to be broken down into mosaics. For instance, just as the retina is a mosaic of sensations, so too is the visual cortex a mosaic. But memory seems to resist this breakup. The total organization of memory seems to be unbreakable. Another odd thing about memory is that memories don't seem to be stored in one local part of the brain. It seems almost unbelievable, but patients with hemispherectomies, those with half their brain cut out to stop intractable seizures, these patients have little problem with memory. This is true regardless of which side is cut out. It seems memories are stored anywhere and nowhere. Spooky. This only validates what Carl Lashley discovered in the 50s, that the brain exhibits what he calls mass action, that it is the brain as a whole that retains memories rather than any one part. As Lashley concluded after ablating portions of rat brains, front, back, anterior, either side, any combination, and he noted they could still complete the mazes that he had taught them before the ablation. Lashley said, "It's not possible to demonstrate the isolated localization of a memory trace anywhere within the nervous system." End quote. And the current neuroscience work on memory hasn't progressed much beyond that in terms of looking at where memories are stored. That's kind of surprising. I think neuroscience has a ways to go before we understand memory, but I suspect that if the mind is something in addition to the brain, it seems to be using the brain to its decided advantage. Abstract thought. One of Freud's great contributions to psychology was to show that our thoughts may become embodied. A hysterical patient with pain in the larynx had been given a reproach from a friend that had been hard to swallow. A hysterical patient with an attack of asthma had repressed the idea that he can't breathe the atmosphere at home. A man suffering from paralysis of the legs can't go on anymore. A woman who vomits when she eats cannot digest some unpleasant fact, and so on. Freud thought that what hysterical patients do is they go back to the bodily origins of the mind and restore thoughts to their biological origin. Even abstract thought he attempted to explain in this way. For instance, he said that when you say no, when you reject an idea as false, that's only a more evolved way of repressing an idea from consciousness, in which you don't really say it's false, you just ignore it, which is itself a more evolved form of a primitive reflex, the sort of negativism and reflexes we find in Alzheimer's, so-called Gegenhalten contractions. Freud said repression may, without a doubt, be correctly described as an intermediate state between a defensive reflex and a condemning judgment. Now, I'm sympathetic to evolution. I'm sympathetic to much of Freud and to his project of showing how abstract thought is rooted in the body. But we need to be careful here. We run into logical problems when we try to explain logical thought in physical terms. In the first place, Truth and falsity are not characteristics of physical objects. A brain cannot be true or false no more than a bratwurst can be true or false. A bratwurst isn't true or false, it just is. Even if the bratwurst is made of chicken, we call it a false bratwurst. We don't mean the same thing as when we say a thought is true or false. A chicken bratwurst isn't lying to you, it just isn't asserting anything. It just is a chicken bratwurst. So too with the brain. The brain just is, it isn't true or false. It can't be. Our thoughts, on the other hand, can. But see, that elevates them above the world of physical objects. If our thoughts were physical objects, not only would it be silly to call them true or false, but there's another problem involved. We wouldn't be able to trust them. How could you trust a thought to be true if you knew it was caused? C.S. Lewis wrote, "The easiest way of exhibiting this is to notice the two senses of the word because. We can say, grandfather must be ill today because he ate lobster yesterday. We can also say, grandfather must be ill today because he hasn't got up yet. And we know he's an early riser when he's well." In the first sentence, because indicates cause and effect. The eating made him ill. In the second, it indicates the relation of what logicians call ground and consequent. The old man's late rising is not the cause of his disorder, but the reason why we believe him to be disordered. So on the left side, when we say because, we mean physical causation. On the right side, when we say because, we make a logical inference that has nothing to do with causation. And this causes confusion that we use the same word. Viktor Frankl said the same thing in a famous favorite line of his. "When you cut an onion, your tears have a cause, but you have no reason to weep." Our bodies are subject to causes, our minds subject to reasons. Let's imagine for a moment this is all hogwash. The mind is really nothing but the brain, and that as physical objects, your ideas, all of them, have physical causes. Your neurons fire, and you can't not think of a buffalo. How then can you know that your thoughts are true or false? Notice that we commonly discredit a person's opinions if we have reason to suspect there's a cause for them. "Oh, you only believe in God because you're raised to. You say that because you want it to be true. You're just drunk." But then notice what happens there. If we actually believe that all thoughts, all mental events have physical causes, why doesn't that call all of our thoughts into doubt? Why doesn't it call the thoughts of the neuroscientist into doubt? How can we tacitly hold some thoughts exempt? A neuroscientist has a thought. The mind is nothing but the brain. But if he or she could not help having that thought, why would it be true? The idea that all thought is physical and has physical causes seems to me, therefore, not only false but incoherent. In the time that remains, I want to talk briefly about intentionality and then finish by discussing purposes, desires, and free will, finally. Intentionality, I'll explain what it is, but it's one of the most difficult things for, I think, a physicalist to explain. Intentionality comes from the word intention with an S. It doesn't mean intention as in like a purpose or an intent. It basically means that our thoughts are always about something besides themselves. In other words, it's impossible to have a thought about that very same thought. Can't do it. No thought is about itself the way a physical object is about itself. Grizzly bears are about grizzly bears, if they are about anything at all, which is doubtful. Grizzly bears aren't about honey, they aren't about the state of California, they aren't about Chicago football. But in your mind, a grizzly bear may be about any of those things, or anything at all. But in the world of physical objects, this is a strange thing. It would be strange. It doesn't really fit. Consider a pencil and the vocalization, pencil. Literally what we mean when we say, that's a pencil. It's really quite strange. We are identifying an object with a vocalization. There's a pencil. What in the world does your larynx vibrating and making the sound pencil have to do with a real pencil? To see how silly this is, all you have to do is repeat the word 100 times. Pencil, 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 pencil. Before long, its intentionality, its directedness, its aboutness is lost, and it sounds like the empty vocalization that it is. But you see, our mind is constantly doing this, making identifications like this, a thought about this, a feeling about that, a desire for this, and so on. That's how our minds work. We can't help it. But this does not seem to be a property shared by the world of matter. Your brain, for instance, isn't strictly about anything. The brain of a man running away from a tiger doesn't think about getting away from the tiger. It doesn't think at all. It undergoes chemical and electrical change. But chemical and electrical change is no more about a tiger than it is about anything else. Suppose we try to get around this problem and say that the brain contains tiny representations of things. And perhaps it does. But that would be not enough to explain intentionality. When you go to the Louvre, you buy a poster version of the Mona Lisa. The original painting is about the real lady, Mona Lisa. But is the poster about the real lady? Or is it just about the painting, a copy of the painting? It's kind of difficult to say. How about a Xerox copy of a poster of a painting of the Mona Lisa? What is the Xerox copy about? It's just a mindless piece of paper. It certainly doesn't know that it's only a Xerox copy. Surely it would be a bit much to maintain it's not really about the poster it's a copy of, but it is really about the real lady named Mona Lisa. You see, intentionality is lost in an endless regress of representation. So the brain can't explain intentionality by merely having tiny representations of things in it. If the brain is basically a wet computer making copies for itself of the things it sees, how can your thoughts and memories be about anything? They cannot. They will be copies of copies of copies of sense impressions, and that's all. But our thoughts do seem to be about things. So the mind is more than the brain. Finally, the cognitive division of the mind, the will. First, I want to point out that purposes and desires are not attributes of material things, brain included. If we were to try to banish all mental terms from neuroscientific parlance, as Paul Churchland suggests we do, if we wanted to say strictly scientific things about a person running from a tiger, all we can technically say is that their brain has a certain state that tends to lead to certain behaviors of frantic running and perspiration. But we can't say that their brain wants or intends to find safety. Those are mental terms. After all, how can we speak of a single neuron wanting or intending anything? Want is a mental term, not a brain term. In fact, as William James pointed out, as far as wants are concerned, the brain is quite indifferent and would quite as cheerfully compass the person's destruction as its escape. We might imagine the brain of a man running from a tiger as making anguished expressions with its gyri and sulci, but we know that's not accurate at all. So desires and intentions don't seem to fit anywhere in the brain. Either they're real and they somehow mysteriously are different than the brain, or they are illusions. What about free will? Freud says something funny about free will at the end of his Psychopathology of Everyday Life. He spends the whole book showing how numerous actions, and I don't mean to slam the book, it's an amazing book. Everyone should read it. He spends the whole book showing how numerous actions seem free but are not. But he finishes by saying that the paranoiac, though he constantly misinterprets others, is actually right in saying everything he observes in others is full of significance. He recognizes something that escapes the normal person. He sees the actions of others are all determined by hostile and other wishes. But surely this is ridiculous. Are we really to maintain if we carry it out? Are we really to maintain that a person with OCD who cannot help washing their hands and who feels every action to be compelled, feels they're not free, can we really believe this person is less deluded than the normal person who lives under the pleasant illusion of having a free will? Finally, if free will is an illusion, there are numerous absurd consequences. And I know this is a huge free will. We could debate this for hours and days, I know. I'm compressing it into 2 minutes. Finally, if free will is an illusion, there are numerous other absurd consequences. As Bertrand Russell wrote, if when a man writes a poem or commits a murder, the bodily movements involved are solely resulting from physical causes, it would seem absurd to put up a statue to him in the one case, the poet, or to hang him in the other, the murderer. Absurd indeed. St. Thomas Aquinas said the same thing, gave a very similar proof for free will in one line. And it's a proof, it may not seem to be a proof, but if you know what a reductio ad absurdum is, it's a form of proof where you show that if you take something to be true, you have to throw out all these common sense notions. And if you don't want to throw out all those common sense notions, which most people don't, they're less willing to reject those than they are willing to reject this thing called free will. That's a reductio ad absurdum. Man has free will. Otherwise, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would all be in vain. But they're not in vain. We use these expressions every day. We don't assume they're just a silly way of talking, right? When we stop believing in free will, we're in trouble. We're in the sort of trouble a man would be in who told his judge that he couldn't have acted otherwise than he did, that he was compelled by his brain chemistry. Can he really complain, and can we complain, when the judge smiles and agrees with him wholeheartedly, and then lets the cruel gavel fall, pronouncing him guilty, in prison for life, with lifetime psychiatric treatment for a minor crime, and says, I see you are compelled, and so am I. That brings me to my end, and so I hope I've left enough space for questions, and you have them, and covered a lot of esoteric stuff, but I know that these topics provoke a lot of thought. Yeah.
Thank you. So, thank you for your talk. When Western civilization was transitioning into the Enlightenment, Galileo, who was a scientific thinker, went to the Church Fathers and said, look, fellows, I have good news. I have discovered that the sun is the center of the universe. Come, look in my telescope. And they instead called the Inquisitor and had him put away for the rest of his life. It seems to me that in many ways, 400 years later, the scientists are returning the favor, saying, we know and we don't want to find mystery. No, that's not true in all of science, because the physicists, the cosmologists, seem to be pretty comfortable knowing that 85% of the universe is dark energy and it cannot be measured. It can only be inferred because it has some effect on what is measurable. And to me, that's a very good model for us to follow, to say we don't have to know everything. There's something very mysterious about this, that if we get so uptight about not knowing all the time, we simply close our minds. In the same way, we're just becoming the Church Fathers to Galileo and saying, we already know, don't bother us with details. We already know. Yeah. So anyway, I just thought I would share that, and thank you.
Your comment, yeah, I think it's really wise, and how our history repeats itself. There's a funny view. There's a lot of philosophical terms on this subject that I totally just kept out of this talk. Monism, dualism, there's a whole, but you don't really need to think in terms of those terms. But there's one that's really funny. It's called Mysterianism. And Mysterianism is the view that mind is ultimately reducible to matter, but we'll never be able to prove it. And when I first read it, it's one of the many serious ideas entertained by the physicalists, the camp that thinks the mind is nothing but the brain. And I just find it funny because it kind of resembles, let's say, an old school church argument that you can't argue with. You know, the mind is nothing but the brain, but we can never prove that. And it's funny. Even Jung, we're doing a book reading club on Jung right now, and Jung points out something funny. He points out how unscientific a lot of scientific terms are. So matter, the word matter, just like what you're saying, a lot of the universe we don't know. Jung says matter, that comes from the word for mother. It's not a scientific term at all. If you look at the etymology, it means mother. So it's not like we know what matter is. No one's seen matter. It's a mystery, right? Yeah.
Tom, thank you. Is this working? Thank you for this. It reminded me of college philosophy classes and debates, and I always enjoyed those and loved thinking about them. But your talk sounds like it's a defense of Descartes and his dualism. And in psychiatry, psychosomatic medicine, particularly in consultation psychiatry, we try to teach holism, a holistic approach to the patient, so that doctors won't see psychiatric or mental problems as very separate from the diseases that they're treat, but rather there's a whole person that has something that has to be taken in complete context.
Sure. So it's true, my talk seems like it's supporting mind stuff and matter stuff are from these different worlds. They don't seem to mix very well. I didn't really comment on metaphysical views, what's ultimately real, and how do mind and matter interact. Does one only cause the other, or they both go both ways? But there's a lot of views on that, and it's a lot of what I was doing in this talk is really trying to cause the monist, the person who thinks matter is the only thing, just to loosen them up. But I'm totally open, and a lot of like dualist sounding philosophers are really open, and psychiatrists are really open to the possibility that mind and matter are the same thing. But that would be called neutral monism, that there's only one kind of thing in the universe, and that we don't really fully know what it is, but it has attributes of mind and matter. That would be one way to soften that. Another way is in Aristotle and Aquinas with hylomorphism, and that's the view that mental things shape matter and exist in matter and give them their form. But I don't have time to go into that. But I agree that Descartes, there's a lot of things about Descartes that are somewhat ridiculous. The pineal gland being a famous thing that he said, that the soul is in the pineal gland. If you think about it, there's some reason to it. It probably had some reason because it's like it's just one of them. Maybe it has two sides. It probably does, but there's just one of them, so it's, that must be where the soul resides. But my thoughts on that, as ridiculous as it is it any less ridiculous to say, as a lot of neuroscientists will say, oh, look at this gyrus right here. That's where thought is. So reducing thought, they still try to put it somewhere, locally. And so I'm in favor of views of the brain and the body that take the soul and take the mind holistically. Descartes set up a funny thing by trying to separate the two so much. He was in the gardens of I think the Versailles and other French gardens where they would have these statues that move, with hydraulic. Like even in the 1700s, they'd have like something you'd step on in the garden, and it would set off a pump or some water spout, and the statues would actually start moving. And he was inspired by that to try to show how the body is very mechanical. So once he separated it, I think in an ironic way, Descartes like really launched the modern way of looking at the brain.
I'm hearing some
Separating the
feedback.
two. Sure.
I'm not sure if someone at one of the remote sites wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, hearing none, I think Tommy will be around for a little bit if anyone wants to speak to him individually. Otherwise, let's give him a round of applause for his presentation.
Thank you.